Okay, hi everybody, and good afternoon here. We're working on the externalization of the hierarchy, and it is the 10th of February, and we're on program number 17. We've done about, 35 to 38 hours here on this. Some of the programs are longer, and some are of 1 hour duration. So now we enter a new section of the work. But, I always like to, when I can, give a little segue. The future world order will be the effective expression of a fusion of the inner spiritual way of life and the outer civilized and cultured way of acting. This is a definite possibility because humanity in its upper brackets has already developed the power to live in the intellectual and physical world simultaneously, and many today are living in the spiritual world, and we would say intellectual world and physical world simultaneously. He says tomorrow there will be many more. All right, now we look at some problems, and let's see, we're beginning on page 194. Let's see if these problems are still existing and what we can possibly do about them. The New World Order will be confronted by many problems. These problems will not be solved by the imposition of a solution by means of force, as in the Axis world order. Force can only go so far, obviously. Okay. They will be solved by right educational processes and by understanding the objectives of the true New World Order. So education all the time. Master DK is part of the educational group, obviously, and in Master KH's ashram, and it is through the correct form of education, which has never yet been widely applied, that the opposition to the coming wonders of the New Age under the New World Order will be eliminated. They fall roughly into four categories, these problems: the racial problem, the economic problem, the problem of government, and the religious problem. Now remember, in the problems of humanity, later he expands upon these. Okay, and I just want to make that a little bigger so it's easy to see from where we began. Okay, there is no way, this is the racial problem. There is no way of solving the racial problem by legislation, segregation, or by the efforts to produce national blocs, as in the case of Germany today, where she, notice the feminine pronoun, where she proclaims Germany as the super race. Such efforts only produce insuperable barriers. With very few exceptions, there are no pure races. That's really important to understand. And maybe, I don't know, does he include enforced integration? I'm not sure. Let's see. So we can't do it by legislation. We can't do it by segregation or producing national blocs of so-called pure racial types, as in Germany proclaiming a super race, which anyone's eyes will reveal as fallacious. Such efforts will only produce insuperable barriers. With very few exceptions, there are no pure races. And maybe some of them, are at the early stages of human development. Germany, in particular, by its place at the crossroads of Europe is definitely the fusion of many strains. And that, of course, is something that the Nazis would never admit, but then again, they planned to eliminate those many strains and rebreed the pure Teuton of 250,000 years ago. You should read some of the propaganda of the racial theorists who had also a semi-occult background, Guido von List, Jorg Lentz, those kinds of people. And you will see what the intention was. Tides of emigration, marching armies throughout the centuries, and modern travel have inextricably mixed and fused all the races. No, this is fact. And of course, the modern Germany no longer promotes this idea of the super race. There may be occasional racial theorists and Nazis remaining, but the government of Germany, now increasingly under the ray of harmony, does not promote this presently. It may therefore be assumed that any attempt to isolate a race or to enforce so-called racial purity is foredoomed to failure. And, certainly this is also the case with the Jews, which it is a religion, Judaism is, and again, it's obvious that no pure racial type exists. The only solution of this problem is the basic recognition that all men are brothers. Certainly interiorly they are, and one can be born in any bodily form. All men are brothers, that one blood pours through human veins, certainly one etheric energy, that we are all the children of the one Father, and that our failure to recognize this fact is simply an indication of man's, and there's the word, stupidity. Well, now, the truth emerges, and the way of racial egotism has gone down to defeat. Some try now to revive it, but one can only hope that humanity learned such a lesson in the Second World War that any type of revival of that kind of racial superiority will be eventually doomed to failure. We do see it, in the conflict between the white group and in contrast with Orientals and black people and Native Americans. We see this egotism still applying to the white group, Caucasian group. They're sometimes called historical backgrounds, climatic conditions, and widespread intermarriage have made the different races what they are today. Yes, an unquestioned mixture. That's what they are today. And now they have this sort of DNA analysis, and you can tell certain percentages of your ancestry. People seem to go in for that. They're still very interested in the body, really. Essentially, however, humanity is one, the heir of the ages, the product of many fusions, conditioned by circumstances, enriched by the processes of evolutionary development. It's the basic unity. The basic unity must now be recognized. This basic unity. Well, we still have a few years to go, I think, and certain modes of thought have to prove their uselessness, their futility, and their danger before the attitudes the Tibetan is expressing here even 80 years ago become pervasive in today's world. The major racial problem has for many centuries been the Jewish, which has been brought to a critical point by Germany. Okay, well, the factors of the first ray and the third ray, soul and personality ray of the Jewish group has contributed to this, but there is certainly plenty of hope with Virgo and the second ray coming in for that group. This problem is also capable of solution if properly recognized for what it is, and if coupled with the effort by the Jews themselves to solve it and to be cooperative in the world efforts to adjust this problem. And I think progress has been made along this line over the last 80 years, and the reform movement is strong in Judaism, and people are abandoning the old ways. It's in Orthodox Judaism that the problem really lies, and the Tibetan has said at some point that it's filled with hatred. I don't know that much about it, but from his perspective, one just has to accept it. This they have not yet done. Okay, the Jews have not yet, at that time, 1940, cooperated in the efforts to adjust their problem. But as I say, post-war, so much has been done. This they have not yet done because the average Jew is lonely and unsettled, able to do little to put himself right before the world. Instinctively and intellectually, the Jew is separative. Intuitively, he has vision, but at the same time, he possesses no sense of fusion with other people. But there has been the assimilative movement, and that is what is suggested by the Tibetan as the right course of action. Of course, protested against by many of the Jewish group, but assimilation has been, I think, in many ways winning the day. It's not so among the Orthodox part of Jewry, and when you enter that and the considerations there's a lot of opprobrium attached to intermarriage and so forth, even though a clear analysis of the situation would show that Judaism is simply a faith. It may have been a faith that was popular with certain national and ethnic groups over the years, but Jews are found everywhere under every racial type, and many of them are indeed mixtures of types. There is no scientific and hitherto unknown mode of solving racial problems. Maybe we better, really look at that. Here he is talking as the war is proceeding with considerable violence. What is this, April 1940? I think that's where we are. It is finally a question of right thinking, decent behavior, and simple kindness, as often existed between people of differing faiths before the fanatical leaders got themselves involved and began to foment cleavage and hatred. The question will not be solved by intermarriage, that's maybe all of it, or by isolating groups for occupation of special areas, or by any man-made ideas of superiority or inferiority. Now, at one point, he seems to be generalizing here about the different races and the possibility of intermarriage, and he seems to say that it won't work in the case of any of them. Maybe assimilation, does it involve intermarriage? I think to a certain extent, because later he promotes that. But then between people of different faiths, they oftentimes have more or less the same racial background, if not thought form background or religious background. So the question, this is so key. It is finally a question of right thinking, decent behavior, and simple kindness. And all through the war, you found people who held to this. regardless of the threat, and they often lost their lives in doing so. And simple kindness. The question will not be solved by intermarriage or by isolating groups for occupation of special areas or by any man-made ideas of superiority or inferiority. The real hierarchy exists in the inner worlds, not the outer, and it has to do with the unfoldment of the causal body and spiritual contact and the ability to touch higher realms and appropriate their energy and apply their energy. That's where merit shows itself. It's the result of continuous reincarnation. It doesn't show itself in particular types, although maybe some types contain, as he says, more individuals who are newer to their reincarnational process than others. Right human relations will come by a mutual recognition of mistakes, by sorrow for wrong action in the past, and by restitution if possible. So this is the question, right human relations will come by mutual recognition of mistakes, by sorrow for wrong action in the past. I'm sure if we all saw the big movie of our many lives, there would be many moments of sorrow for things done amiss, and maybe we wouldn't have to even wait until the movie included past lives. We could see the movie of the present life, and we will when we pass on. Sorrow for wrong action of the past, by restitution where possible. It will come when nations can be educated to appreciate the good qualities of other nations and to comprehend the part they play in the whole picture. It will be developed when the sense of racial superiority is killed, when racial differences and racial quarrels are relegated to the unholy past, and only a future of cooperation and of understanding is actively developed. It will make its presence felt when the living standards of right relation, sought by the enlightened of every race, become the habitual attitude of the masses, and when it is regarded as contrary to the best interests of any nation to spread those ideas which tend to erect racial and national barriers, arouse hatreds, or foster differences and separations. Such a time will surely come. Humanity will master the problems of right human relations and attitude. This is an excellent paragraph on right human relations, which will be, inevitable, but how long must we wait? That's the question. I guess it begins with every one of us, and it also begins with the elimination of fear. Somehow the various races do fear each other in many situations, and they do not want to take the risk. That kind of fear-mongering is being used right now in the year 2019 to block Central Americans from approaching the United States, even though these people from Guatemala, Honduras, etc., are fleeing for their lives, and the impossibility of making a living. Of course, if we really begin to share, we can raise the living standard of many countries so that these kinds of difficult migrations become less common, and where people are, they can thrive. But the policy of sharing has not been advanced by the wealthy nations because, by and large, the nationals are still too selfish. Okay, but I think this is very important. It will come when the nations can be educated to appreciate the good qualities of other nations and to understand the part they play. That's why studying the destiny of the nations is so important, seeing what are the soul qualities of these different nations and what are their rays, what are their astrological signs, what unique part do they play in giving to the whole, and inevitably they do with respect to something. Every human being is an aspect of the will of God. So must be really then every nation when mutual respect is operative between them. Yes, well, this is up for solution once again, and the holdouts who cannot call racism by its own name, but who are racist, are still with us. We have to have, that underlying picture of progress through reincarnation, progress through the development of the occult structure of man, the causal body, the egoic lotus, progress through alignment, progress through the antikarana, progress through intensifying and ever higher points of tension, and progress through focus in ever higher aspects of our nature while still being able to wield the lower aspects constructively. Okay. It is inevitable that racial differences, national quarrels, and caste distinctions exist, but it is equally imperative that they disappear. I remember that moment, I'm sorry, I'm not really a movie buff, but I remember when I go to movies because some of them seem to really show the human condition. And there was this movie Gandhi, and I'd mentioned it before, but a Hindu man was horrified that he had killed a Muslim in that terrible war that seemed to follow World War II. And Gandhi advised him and said, okay, select a child and raise him as a Muslim. Select an orphan, and raise him as a Muslim. And this would be the counteraction to that slaying. It would help to restore the balance. After all, Gandhi had a very Libran, I think he was Sun in Libra rising, so he understood the balance. The world is one world. See, the fragmentation of illusion has to be overcome. The world is one world. Humanity is one unit in the evolutionary process. Differences are man-made and engender hatreds and separation. Well, it all makes so much sense. It's all so terribly obvious if we simply have love and goodwill and the inability to see beyond fragmentation. But then we have to use the intuition, which is a fusing factor, to overcome illusion. Take a look at the planets that rule the intuition. They are Jupiter, Neptune, and Mercury, and they all, in the higher aspects of their expression, promote fusion and the ingathering of many to be made as one. Mercury links everything up. Neptune destroys the boundaries, and Jupiter makes the wholeness out of the many parts. When the children of the various races are taught from their earliest years that there are no differences, that all men are brothers, and that the apparent distinctions are essentially superficial, then future generations will approach the problem of world interrelations unhandicapped by prejudice, by pride of race, or by instilled historical resentments. It's again, what can we say? It's always this quality of education. Even, when DK was looking at the Nazi youth, he said, well, look, they've been educated that way by a very sinister method of education, and they, in a way, don't know any better. So the people who have the educational responsibility, it's a great responsibility. They have that, and they have to fulfill that responsibility in the right way. Otherwise, we'll continue to have the world that we had then and that we still have now. By right education, little children can be taught right attitudes and will respond, for a child sees and recognizes no differences. I guess they've been, purified by the inner life which they have experienced between incarnations. And the truth of the biblical promise that a little child shall lead them will be proven scientifically true. And that doesn't necessarily mean, as it often means, an initiate of the first degree or second degree will be the leaders. I mean, that is true too, but certain habits of perception of little children who have not been encultured differently or trained to abide by distinction and separation, that type of perception will be required from all. In the New World Order, the educational process will be started. And, I suppose to read education in the New Age is very important. When DK made these different groups, I think he got as far as the education group in terms of writing particular books. Maybe The Destiny of the Nations was a book meant for the political workers. Well, and then maybe The Reappearance of the Christ for the workers in the New World Religion. There was no book specifically on science. There were voluminous books on psychology. No book, but chapters up here. No book specifically on economics, but a very great book on magic. So let's just say that economics and science had to be covered in other ways through references, and they have been adequately covered. Well, at least in some initial sense. Okay, now we we go on here to the economic problem, and that is covered in the book Problems of Humanity, and by the discussion of capital and labor, and basically by the discussion of moon chain humanity as it relates to earth chain humanity. Capital having a longer experience and training on the third ray, not only training but equipment on the third ray tends to be from the moon chain, capital from the moon chain, and labor more from the earth chain. Different rays involved and lesser experience with the intelligence factor, but of course many advantages in other ways, and a karma which is far less fraught. The economic problem. This problem is basically far less difficult of solution. Sound common sense can solve it. There are adequate resources for the sustenance of human life, and these science can increase and develop. Well, that is, if we don't ruin our environment and cut off the source of supply for humanity and the other kingdoms through short-sighted greed. The racial types, that problem, that's very, very ingrained, and it really calls for a bridging of types and an appreciation of what the different types have to offer, because they all have something unique to offer. The mineral wealth of the world, the oil, the produce of the fields, the contribution of the animal kingdom, the riches of the sea, which we are now destroying, and the fruits and flowers are all offering themselves to humanity. That's the lesser kingdoms, that are making available their gifts to humanity if rightly used. Man is the controller of it all, and they belong to everyone and are the property of no one group, nation, or race. Well, that idea of ownership, that evanescent idea that has to be killed away, that one person or group can, as it were, under some misapplication of Scorpio, corner the market. That has to be erased from acceptable human motives. Man is the controller of it all, and they belong to everyone and are the property of no one group, nation, or race. It is solely due to man's selfishness that in these days of rapid transportation, and how much more rapid now, thousands are starving whilst food is rotting or destroyed. Yeah, just imagine that. And just imagine being on the receiving end of that. As no doubt we have been, in starving situations due to the selfishness of others. And when you want to defeat your enemy, what is one of the things that you do? You try to starve the populace. It's been used many, many times. You make it impossible for the people to sustain their strength. And, Stalin was one of the chief proponents of that brutal method. But it's pretty general when groups are at war. So anyway, food is rotting or destroyed when thousands are starving. It is solely due to the grasping schemes and financial injustices of man's making that the resources of the planet are not universally available under some wise system of distribution, and you begin to see how this can take shape in the Aquarian age, which after all is the sign of distribution. Just think of what it would be in the body if the blood only reached certain areas. There would be some kind of necrosis in the areas that it did not reach. There would be rot and decay and gangrene. There would be all kinds of things happening unless the circulation of the blood went through the entire body. And that's what happens in the psyche of humanity. There are areas of degeneration, pockets of degeneration where the worst ideas are believed because the general goods offered by the planet do not reach these people. Now, imagine having to live off a garbage dump, a huge, huge garbage dump, where you send your children, let's say, to find something edible or useful. So it's inexcusable, it's not allowed, and that really, there's got to be a conscience in the leaders of the wealthy nations to solve this. It can be solved, If we can send a man to the moon, if we can contemplate these trips to Mars, if we can apply the human intellect to send these probes out into space to take pictures of far away situations, we can certainly solve the problem of distribution on our planet. And I'm sure that all will or have experienced hunger, poverty, loss, lack of adequate resources, all of it due to selfishness. But now especially we have the means of distribution, especially now. Maybe in Atlantean days we had it too. The question is, and I don't know, what was the condition of the peoples in Atlantean days? I know there were many horrific things which occurred, and in Lemuria as well. And as the Tibetan has said, humanity has erred grievously. Well, we've all been part of that, and one day we'll see the movie, But hopefully we'll have enough detachment to learn from it instead of being utterly horrified by it. There is no justifiable excuse for the lack of the essentials of life in any part of the world. The essentials of life, not luxury, We're even told that in Atlantis there were heights of luxury reached, which really would be unimaginable to us, so extreme they were. And all those ideas of the cities paved with gold and all that, it comes from Atlantean days. Such a state of lack argues short-sighted policy and the blocking of the free circulation of necessities for some reason or other. All these deplorable conditions are based on some national or group selfishness and on the failure to work out some wise, impartial scheme for the supplying of human need throughout the world. He condemns it, and what else are you going to do? It must be condemned. It is not permissible and certainly no longer permissible. I mean, you've seen this is 2019 and Venezuela is suffering terribly, and the dictator president blocks a major bridge by which a supply of food and other necessities, medical, etc., could reach the people. He eats well, but does he care? No, only about his own power. And that is the ridiculous state of mind of some half-mad egotists who rule countries all to their own advantage. What then must be done apart from the education of the coming generations in the need for sharing and for a free circulation of all the essential commodities? Well, it would be a big change of identity, right? We seem to be egotists, and that is a type of unique blindness. And when we realize that our real identity includes the very person which egotism rejects, maybe we'll change our minds. The cause of this evil way of living is very simple. It is a product of past wrong educational methods of competition and the facility with which the helpless and weak can be exploited. No one group is responsible, as certain fanatical ideologists might lead the ignorant to suppose. Our period is simply one in which human selfishness has come to a climax and must either destroy humanity or be brought intelligently to an end. So he still holds out the possibility of the destruction of humanity. Here it's 1940. Let's keep our dates in mind. Education, wrong educational methods, competition instilled. Now, at the heart of capitalism is the idea that competition will make for the better products and scientific advances and all the rest. I think that's only true in a very limited sense. It's usually cooperation, as in the field of scientific investigation, that the great advances can be made. Always cooperation is greater than the fragmentation of competition, and the facility with which the helpless and weak can be exploited. And what kind of human being do we have to have? What kind of human being is it that looks out and says, they are helpless, they are weak, I can get from them what I want, and, who cares about them? Well, these things will end. Three things will end this condition of great luxury and extreme poverty, of gross overfeeding of the few and the starvation of the many, plus the centralization of the world's produce under the control of a handful of people in each country. Well, we see it today. It hasn't changed, has it? It hasn't. Apparently, there's a famine and there's a response. There's a national tragedy of some kind and there's response, but no real continuity of care. Continuity of care. There isn't that. Not yet. And the other is simply the other and not ourselves. That is how many selfish people see it. And the identification that is inherent in the mind that is in Christ just does not exist in the selfish. They have a ways to go and probably have to suffer more before anything approaching the will to share is arising within them spontaneously. Okay, so what are these three things? They are first, all right, I'm going to make that a big one. Yeah, because one can locate it better than first the recognition that there is enough food, fuel, oil, and minerals in the world to meet the need of the entire population. Now, that is sometimes doubted, the sort of Malthusian thought form, there's not enough to go around, people will kill each other to get what there is, was it Malthus? And I forget his name, was it Thomas? I'm not sure. But anyway, Malthus espoused that point of view and foretold a humanity ever at each other's throats for a limited supply, to control a limited supply of necessities. The problem, therefore, is basically one of distribution. Okay, well, and you can see how people work against distribution. There is aid sitting at the doorstep, and a few selfish people, because of their ego, they stop it, and the rest suffer. We are not beggars, we don't need that, all that attitude. Secondly, this premise of adequate supply handled through right distribution must be accepted, and the supplies which are essential to the health, security, and happiness of mankind must be made available. Well, that's it. Even if there are kind and willing nations to meet the need, will they even be allowed into the country? It's just shameful and completely unacceptable, that attitude of blocking the necessities by which people live and without which they cannot live. Have you seen, I was in Russia at a certain time, and it was before the big change which happened it was in the early 90s, and you would go into a store and there was just, there was just nothing there. Literally nothing. I went into some store and I think there was a cake of lard or something like that. It was, horrible to see. And now they have pictures of grocery stores in Venezuela, and there's nothing. It's all been raided and ransacked, and the mess is lying on the floor, and there's just nothing that people can use. Third, that the entire economic problem and the institution of the needed rules and distributing agencies should be handled by an economic League of Nations. Now, of course, it's hard to give up one's ego, and it's really hard to give up the sense of personal sovereignty and then extend that to national sovereignty. Even now, it's topical, but when you look at the Brexit problem, it has a lot to do with this idea of national sovereignty and not wanting to be subject to the European Union, a kind of a league of member states. It's very hard to give up one's autonomy in a trusting manner to a larger body. But eventually this will have to be done, and we can hope that we come up with that larger body which is truly trustworthy, a world government which is really designed to bring forth the best for everybody, and that will require leaders who are educated in right human relations and who are intellectually, morally, even physically suited for the task, and certainly spiritually suited for the task. In this league, all the nations will have their place. They will know their national requirements based on population and internal resources, and will know also that they can contribute to the family of nations. All will be animated by the will to the general good. How beautiful this is. A will to good that will probably at first be based on expediency and national need, but which will be constructive in its working out. Well, that's, sometimes it seems, given present circumstances, impossible under the present regimes. But we know it's not, and we know it will happen. A league of economic league of nations. I'm going to make that bigger because it's such a key idea. And when reviewing this, certain things stand out. And it's based on need. It's not based on egotistical desire to have more, be more important, and all that. People will see truthfully who they are and will see where they stand. It's like the analogy to a human being. A person can want to be king of the world, and in some people's fantasies there is that kind of mad hope. But an honest evaluation of where one stands will be necessary for any real progress. We are where we are precisely because of what we have done and how we have used the resources with which we are equipped in our energy system. Some of us are lower than we should be because we've made poor use of our abilities. Some are higher because they've made very good use of the abilities they had. DK began a letter to RVB saying, he was Alice Bailey's secretary, says, you have made more progress, did he say, in this life? I'm not sure, but you've made more progress than either your soul or I thought possible to you. I paraphrase slightly, but that's the idea. So one can, given the talents, 5, 2, or 1, the lord of the manor hands out the talents and goes away. And then the one with 5 makes 10, the one with, 5, 2, the one with 2, is it 2? Makes 4, doubles, and the one with 1 hid his talent because he was afraid that he would lose it, and it ends up being taken away from him anyway. So we have to take what we have and develop it. That's our assignment for an incarnation. Certain facts are obvious. The old order has failed. Okay. Now, people really have to get that in their minds. You can have a very successful family financially in the midst of the rotting old order, and eventually you'll be taken down too. The old order has failed. The resources of the world have fallen into the hands of the selfish, and there has been no just distribution. Some nations have had too much and have exploited their surplus. Other nations have had too little, and their national life and their financial situation has been crippled thereby. The old order has failed. Well, you have to face facts before you can really do anything about it. That's so obvious. And today we would even say again, what else could we say? The old order has failed. The North-South divide, which was so popular to discuss some decades ago, between the contrast between the very rich and the poor, it indicates a system of care and distribution which has failed. So we have to admit that, and as in the life of any individual coming to a point of assessment, what I've been doing has not worked. I've got to try something else, What did Einstein say? That a good definition of insanity is to keep on doing the same old thing and expect different results. At the close of this war, all the nations will be in financial difficulties. All nations will require rebuilding. All will have to attend actively to the settlement of the future economic life of the planet and its adjustment along sounder lines. Well, this was certainly the case for Great Britain and many of the destroyed nations. When you look at the bombing that took place in UK, you can understand it. And Germany was destroyed. Maybe all of Japan was not destroyed, but certain cities received a terrible warning in the dropping of those atomic bombs. There was destruction everywhere. And then DK writes about the necessary rehabilitation of the nations. Well, we're still in the process of rehabilitating. No nation has reached its full potential. And is there any nation out there that is truly a first degree initiate and truly acting in conformity with its soul? Some national idealists think that their country has reached that point, and maybe they're correct. I cannot say. I know I had a friend, he's passed now, but he felt that Finland had reached the first initiation because of its manner of conducting the Winter War, which it eventually lost, but at least prevented the invasion of Finland by the Soviet armies and the many, many sacrifices that were called upon, as you would have in the case of a first initiation. He felt it was a first initiation process. That Finland is one of the cleaner countries in many ways, and certainly one of the least corrupt, and it's been judged that it has the happiest people. Well, there are some indications that they've done things right, perhaps because, as my wife says, the Finns are blue-eyed. They do not twist things around. They do not lie. Do the same. Everybody lies, of course. There's lying in the world, but everybody has lied. But they tend to see things straighter and are not manipulative, and they don't have that third ray quality. Of course, there are people in the nation that do, but as a whole, the blue-eyed along the ray 2 and 6 line, which does not distort. And maybe there are other nations in the world that feel because of their sufferings they have passed as a nation to the first degree, but I think it's very unlikely, and maybe unlikely here too in Finland. I don't know. I'm not in a position really to judge. My penetration of the national psyche is limited because of the language, but we're all on our way to having initiate nations. We are. And when they begin to live and express according to the abilities of their soul, then the possibility of the initiation of an entire nation, at least of the first degree, is possible. Right now, there's a lot of house cleaning going on and a lot of selfishness to eject in so many powerful nations, and they still are looking at that extension of egotistical power, which we call nationalism. Anyway, onward. The period of adjustment offers the opportunity to effect drastic and deeply needed changes and the establishing of a new economic order based on the contribution of each nation to the whole, their sharing of the fundamental necessities of life, and the wise pooling of all resources for the benefit of everybody, plus a wise system of distribution. Such a plan is feasible. Such a plan, even now, 80 years later, has not occurred, but it will occur in the age of distribution and after the suffering is adequate. It's such a shame that a group on the fourth race, such as humanity, has to learn primarily through suffering. We've all been in that case, and we don't know what virtues of which we may now be possessed have been the direct result of the suffering we have passed through in many lives. The solution here offered is so simple that for that very reason it may fail to make an appeal. The quality required by those engineering this change of economic focus is so simple also. The will to good, goodwill, eventually, that again, it may be overlooked, but without simplicity and goodwill, little can be effected after the war. So just because something is obvious doesn't mean that it will be applied. Let's just say human selfishness runs deep, and it has been, maybe I should make that green, the color of the third ray. It runs deeper than we know, and it has been fostered by those deliberate forces which seek the thwarting of the divine plan and the downfall of humanity. How they can ever get to that point of view is probably a mystery to all except those who are very, very high initiates. The great need will be for men and women of wide sympathy. You think of the United Nations, you think of Dag Hammarskjöld, you think of Robert Mueller, who was such a constant speaker at the Lucis Trust in New York, a very compassionate and sympathetic man who had been through a lot. There have been people of fulfilling these kinds of qualities in the United Nations. The great need will be for men of vision, of wide sympathy, technical knowledge, and cosmopolitan interest. They must possess also the confidence of the people. They must meet together and lay down the rules whereby the world can be adequately fed. They must determine the nature and extent of the contribution which any one nation must make. And therein, you're asking too much from us. That will be the universal cry at first. They must settle the nature and extent of the supplies which should be given to any nation. Oh, you're not giving us enough. We don't have enough from you. You can understand. That will be, for many nations, an initial response. And so bring about those conditions which will keep the resources of the world circulating justly and engineer those preventive measures which will offset human selfishness and greed. Well, it seems so reasonable. It seems that any person with a little bit of idealism could get a hold of this and say, this is doable. All we have to do is share. We have to be intelligent. We have to care about each other. We have to have sympathy, compassion for each other. We have to see ahead the possibilities. All those things are easily put in place. What is it that stops this? Now, some of the religious people among us will say, well, it's old Adam, and man is born in sin, and he's everywhere going to be sinful unless he accepts, let's say, Jesus or Christ as his Savior and so forth. Well, there is that entrenched lower nature, the elemental nature, but this is precisely what we can learn to redeem. Can such a group of people be found? I believe it can, he says. Everywhere there are deep students of human nature, scientific investigators with wide human sympathies, and conscientious men and women who have for long, under the old and cruel system, wrestled with the problem of pain and need. So when the war is over, can these people be found? And indeed, the United Nations flourished and the people were found, but if you don't carry through, then the initial impulse can wane and the beneficial organization can come under attack by those who are selfish and feel they have to contribute too much to globalism. See, this is the age of the group. This is the age of the global humanity and widespread realization that humanity is one all over the globe. And you know how people resist this today. It's a dirty word to them, globalism, Anyway, it's coming, and one has to wear down the opposition, and the opposition has to be seen to be useless. The new era of simplicity must come in. Simplicity is the quality of Shambhala, we've been told. The New World Order will inaugurate the simpler life based on adequate food, right thought, creative activity, and happiness. These essentials are only possible under a right economic rule. This simplification, this wise distribution of the world's resources must embrace the high and the low, the rich and the poor, thus serving all men alike. Well, we've reached our hour. The new era of simplicity must come in. And, with under the Shambhala impacts, perhaps humanity can be led towards the realization that the complicated life is not necessarily the happy one or the good one. The New World Order will inaugurate this simpler life based on adequate food, right thought, creative activity, and happiness. It's clear. It's clear. And it was clear back then to the Tibetan in 1940. And here it is, 2019. All right, humanity seems to learn slowly. So this is end, and I'm not sure, how much I can go on, many requirements today. End of hour 1. Now we have the problem of government, and this is a major problem today. There are so many instances of corruption and selfishness and egotism and not being able to grasp the greater whole. Sometimes one's country becomes the extension of one's ego, and all other countries are just the other and do not deserve as much care or attention. Coming now to the realm of government under the New World Order, one is faced with a very complex situation. Indeed, it is. Certain great ideological regimes have divided the world into opposing groups, not blocs for, but blocs against. He tells us that the blocs for will be very useful. Certain great ideological regimes have divided the world into opposing groups. Now, this is still so, although it's gone under the radar just a little bit. There was a time when democracy and communism were at each other's throats utterly, and this is no longer the case. There seems to be some kind of cooperation which has taken place between a major originally communistic nation like China and the United States, the sort of vanguard, it has been at least, of the Western democracies, all for economic advantage, really, and sometimes a secondary motive when used to advance a primary motive, primary concern, is acceptable. There are the great democracies under which certain of the few remaining monarchies find a place. Let's just say, in Europe, we have England, let's say, we have Spain, we have Denmark, we have Sweden, but they are basically constitutional monarchies and essentially democracies. There are the totalitarian powers in which the ancient dictatorships and autocracies of the past are summed up. Well, this might still be the case, but at that time it certainly was the case when you looked at the Soviet Union, and then, of course, what the Axis powers did with it. Their own, a mix between communism and totalitarianism. There was nothing new in the Axis policies. They are essentially reactionary groups for tyrants. Cruelty and the exploitation of the weak are part of the ancient history. So the Axis at that time brought nothing new, and the attempt to revive the ideologies of the Axis as presently found in humanity brings nothing new, just the same old. Master Moria talks about the monotony of the presentation of the Dark Lodge. And indeed, if you listen to the idealism of the resurgent Nazis and fascists, it's hopelessly dull and has nothing to do with human potential and is a type of glamour which is grabbing people and reducing their possibilities. The democracies, with all their present ineffectiveness, have in them the germ of that which is truly new. I think Churchill summed this up. I can't find it right now, but he says, democracy is the worst and the most frustrating. And he went on with all of these negatives. And finally, the best form of government after all of that. Of course, he was extremely witty, and maybe I can find what he says. I don't know. Okay, so here is something of that idea. Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in the world of sin and woe. This world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms which have been tried from time to time. Anyway, and he has said some other things that are even more poignant and more humorous in certain ways. Here are some ideas on democracy, and but we could go on it anyway. At the end, it says, "If that is democracy, I salute it, I espouse it, I would work for it." What an orator! By his oratory, sometimes I feel he saved the Western world by his credible power of thought and his ability to move not only the masses, but the very intelligent people. We need leaders like that as much as they may be hated by the selfish. He had his ideas, he had his opinions. They were sometimes a little outrageous compared to the popular trend of thought, but without him, England would have fallen, I think, and Europe would have fallen, and the United States would have been imperiled from the east and from the west. Anyway, amazing man. It's interesting how the bust of Churchill, the sculpture, keeps on being removed, brought back, removed, brought back in the White House, depending on the sympathies of the incoming president. I don't know. The irony is that it seems to be the Democrats that remove him and the Republicans who replace him. The democracies, with all their present ineffectiveness, have in them the germ of that which is truly new, and for they are the expression of an upward surging towards self-rule and self-mastery by humanity as a whole. Okay, well, here he evaluates the different forms of government and his unique point of view. There is also the communistic ideal, which is a curious blend of individualism, dictatorship, the ancient conflict between labor and capital, the Sermon on the Mount, and the worst aspects of revolution and exploitation. That's an amazing sentence, and he evaluates, accordingly to what he has seen. Communistic ideal. Well, some of the early Christian groups were communistic in a certain sense. The community was first, and there was maybe much property held in common and so forth. A curious blend of individualism, dictatorship, the ancient conflict between labor and capital, the Sermon on the Mount, and notice ancient because it comes from the moon chain, right? The Sermon on the Mount, in which very high ideals are set forth, and the worst aspects of revolution and exploitation, the brutality of it. The lines which it will follow, even in the immediate future, are unpredictable. Okay, I think I should have included that as well. Well, it's interesting that a number of the very strongly communistic countries have incorporated capitalistic elements. Not that capitalism is valuable in his eyes. It seems to be based upon selfishness, and as I've said before, he said capitalism has emerged and wrecked the world. Now, that's such a bold statement that you just really have to ponder on that. He might as well be saying that selfishness in the form of economic greed has emerged and wrecked the world. Although, in terms of where the investors' dollars go, is it socially responsible? That's been a new trend, socially responsible investing, and maybe less money comes from it, but more long-term gain. And maybe good ideas are brought forward and they are not stifled by any kind of social idealism. As I've mentioned before, there have been composers and artists who were not allowed to express what was in them because their expressions were not considered conforming to the social ideology. That was happening a lot in Russia some time ago. How it is now, I don't know. There are other countries and peoples whose governments are conditioned by their environment and who at present day play no real determining part in world events except insofar as a greater power uses them. So we see people who have a particular commodity which is exploited by greater powers, and they are subject to the environment. They are the ones who are always experiencing the tsunamis and the volcanic activity and the ravages of nature. They are very vulnerable. Again, there are people and tribes who still pursue their little lives unaffected by the turmoil to be found in the more highly civilized part of the world. And I guess if one place that we might find that kind of thing is in the jungles of different countries. And let's just say the Amazon jungle is always revealing some new tribe which has never made contact with modern civilization. So he's analyzed some different groups here. Totalitarian powers, yes, that he has talked about, and he's talked about the Axis and the democracies, and communism as it has been practiced is very fluid because it certainly began to change under Gorbachev, and it's very different today than under Stalin, and other people who are more victims than they are setting trends and imposing their way, and then some who just don't contact what we call civilized life at all. Behind all this diversity of governmental methods, certain clear outlines are emerging which indicate wider fusions and a tendency to bring about certain syntheses. Well, under the avatar of synthesis, one would expect this to be the case. Of course, when he was writing this, as far as I know, at the moment the avatar had not yet linked up with the planetary logos. I think that was done in, if I'm correct, 1945, certainly in the 40s, I believe. Certain clear outlines are emerging which indicate wider fusions and a tendency to bring about certain syntheses. Various basic trends of thought are appearing, which in the New World Order will unfold into that major synthesis so much desired by the spiritual hierarchy of the planet, and which, whilst preserving the large national and racial outlines, will produce an underlying and subjective state of mind which will end the age of separateness. So already there in 1940 he could see the trends towards synthesis emerging, and certainly, through technology we have an incredible synthesis now. We really are in each other's backyard, and we participate in as the global observer and maybe the global actor in ways that we could not conceive at the time that this was written 80 years ago. So that major synthesis that the spiritual hierarchy so desired by the spiritual hierarchy. He doesn't say it's going to eliminate national differences and boundaries, no, because every nation has its own contribution to make, and we don't want to have one of those leveling experiences where totalitarianism has robbed humanity of its diversity, which is an expression of the will of God. We don't want that. And yet there are people who seem to want that, a complete dull uniformity of the human kind of condition. I'm recalling the very dull way and uniform way that people dressed in communist China, especially the leaders, at a certain point when they were trying to show, in a way they're all the same. And all of that really blocked their true gifts, or at least deluded the people into thinking that they were all the same and were treating each other as equals. We have equality of emergence from the monad and of the monad from greater logoi, but we don't have equality in what people have done through the exercise of their choices. People stand at different levels of evolution based upon their origin, when they came forth and began their reincarnational history. There's, millions of years, even billions of years difference. And naturally, those who've been at it longer will have had more experience and probably, in most cases, developed more capacity. But among the newer group that reincarnating more recently, there are some who move very, very fast, almost as fast as the Christ, and find themselves even ahead of the rank and file that has come from an earlier time of opportunity. Desire is today being evoked for the Federated States of Europe, modeled on the lines of the British Commonwealth of Nations or the United States of America. Well, all right, 1940, and what has emerged but the European Union, which is so challenged today, largely by hidden financial interests. So, now comes the testing point, quite a few, more than half a century later, the European Union, the Federated States of Europe. Okay, there is talk of a new order in Asia. Maybe that did not develop, or the good neighbor policy in America. Some of that developed, of a federal union of democratic nations. Well, maybe this is the United Nations, and DK certainly said, look, don't allow the totalitarian, undemocratic nations in. He said a great mistake was made when Russia was admitted. I'm not sure about maybe communist China, I don't know. But the totalitarian groups, in his view, were mistakenly admitted. There was also the steady spread of the Soviet socialist republics. certain major groupings would seem possible and probably advisable, and they might be as follows. So, analysis of major groupings of nations within humanity. Not within hierarchy, but within humanity. Okay, the federal union of the great democracies after the war. This might include the British Empire as a whole, the United States, the Scandinavian countries, and certain northern European nations, including Germany. So was this done? Well, let's just say this became part of the United Nations. A union of the Latin countries, including, interesting, France, Spain, all the Mediterranean countries, the Balkan countries, except one or two which might be absorbed into the USSR and South America. Well, these became part of the EU. At least, well, the Latin countries are considered in Europe and the Mediterranean, and they're not considered in South America. So here the question is, as we look at it today, we might ask, analyzing this from today's, whoops, I see the problem, A-N-A, analyzing, no suggestion, A-N-A-L-Y-Z-I-N-G, how do you spell that? Analyzing this from today's perspective, are they desirable? Have they occurred, and have they been desirable? Have they occurred in the form the Tibetan foresaw? So the great democracies, I don't know if that, there have been these alliances which NATO as a whole seems to defend, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but it's largely military. The Union of the Latin countries, okay, and Italy would be there, and Spain, and France, and the Balkans, etc. But some of them might go to the USSR and some to the South America, and then the United Soviet Socialist Republic and certain Asiatic nations working in collaboration with them, such as China and later Japan. Now this is very interesting. What the Tibetan foresaw and how the actual working out was different. It is interesting to note how differently alliances worked out from the manner which the Tibetan foresaw. So, this united Soviet Socialist Republic came to an end, but now there is the Russian Federation, which may be in a more gentle way and less enforced, includes many of the same nations. And here we have Russia and China and later Japan all working together. I guess they're part of one great land mass, we might say. But then the Scandinavian countries would be included in that as well, and they're not. They're included in the Union of the Great Democracies. So it's interesting from the 1940 perspective how DK sees this. These three great blocs would not be antagonistic blocs, but simply geographical spheres of interest. Would it have been better had they worked out in this manner? We don't know. They would all three work in the closest unity and economic relation. Each nation within the three blocs would preserve its sovereign independence, but between these independent nations and between these blocs, there would be identity of purpose, unity of effort, and the recognition of the economic control of a league of nations, a league of United Nations controlling the direction and, in general, the economy of the three. The league being formed of the representatives of all nations and its inner governing body, being chosen by the three blocs, would control all sources of supply, distribute all such supplies, and determine all economic policies. Well, it's just the future. It's not seen today, and if you were to present this vision to many in many countries, they would howl with repudiation because it would be taking away their sovereignty, All three would work in the closest unity and economic relation. Each nation within the three blocs would preserve its sovereign independence, but between these independent nations and between these blocs, there would be identity of purpose, unity of effort, and recognition of the economic control of economic league of nations, or a league of nations. Okay, so the welfare of humanity would be the keynote here. So with the details of these future adjustments I shall not deal. They must be wrought out by the men and women of goodwill in the crucible of experiment and experience. It's just obvious that we're not there yet, but the United Nations presented a great possibility and included, maybe in an even more ambitious way, the union of the nations. Only universal disaster could have brought men to the state of mind where, in such propositions and solutions could be presented, the general recognition that the old order has lamentably failed is the most valuable. Now, we still are in a position where the United Nations is seen by some as failing, and it has been politicized badly in many respects. At the same time, you wonder, is he telling us that in order to bring his ideas, which are still more progressive than those occurring in relation to the United Nations, in order to bring about the realization of his ideas, universal disaster of a further kind is required? Well, we have 6 years until the great centennial conclave, and we have to see, to what extent this is the case. To what extent is it the case? Can we stand another universal disaster? Could it be an epidemic of some kind? Could it be environmental in some way? Something has to bring humanity's efforts together in a cooperative way, regardless of what old ideologies it may have followed. The one humanity has to be seen, the preservation of it has to be seen as the objective. Now, actually, what we finished here is the end of 1.5 hours, and we're going to begin a new section, and I just have to see with all my responsibilities here whether I can go on or whether I just have to send this to you as it is. But he's certainly, considering the at a very severe time in the war, really, when many would be depressed about the possibilities of their country or of humanity. He's looking ahead towards the end. Psychologically, it's a very good tactic, and it gets people thinking about inevitable victory and a better way of life, which of course will strengthen them, obviously. So we'll deal with the religious problem. What else? It's a terrible problem today. It's really one of the most difficult, and I think will take us up to the place where the italics run out, and we talk about the task ahead. And then the new group of world servers, important aspects of that group. So, in this wonderful collection of essays that might be ignored by many because they think it dealt topically with only that which was occurring at a particular time, we see that the Tibetan's analysis applies to right now, that humanity has not changed that much. And in fact, many things that he proposes are still unapplied, and many problems still remain. Really, what it is, every human being has to take upon himself or herself the rectification of his own inner psychological condition. It's part of the ongoing psychological rehabilitation of the individuals of the world. And how can you have the psychological rehabilitation of the nations unless the individuals in those nations are also rehabilitated? At least a majority, at least enough to sway the direction of the nation. So, okay, we'll get on to this in just a little while, or I will send it to you as is. Well, I've decided to plunge ahead. I may have to leave this at an odd hour, but let's just see. The religious problem. When we come to consider religion in the New World Order, that's what we're doing. We're considering all of these issues, government, racial issues, religious problems, in light of the New World Order, which DK seeks to bring into form in our thought. We are faced with a far more complicated problem, and yet at the same time with a far easier one. The reason for this is that the subject of religion is one which is studied and somewhat understood by the majority of men. On theological interpretations, there are wide differences. On a widespread recognition of a universal divine intelligence or of God, by whatever name the all-embracing life may be called, there is general agreement, a general similarity of reaction. So differences and yet agreement by and large among the people who are religious that there is a God. Forms of religion are so different and the theological adherents are so fierce. That's a six-ray quality. Let's call it that. Martian. Whoops. Okay. Martian. Six-ray quality. So fierce in their loyalties and partisanships that the emergence of a world religion is necessarily a profound difficulty, at least at the moment. But that emergence is very close at hand, and the differences are relatively superficial. I think certain scientific discoveries about survival and maybe even reincarnation will help. The New World religion is nearer than many think, and this is due to two things. First, the theological quarrels are mainly over non-essentials, and secondly, the younger generation is basically spiritual but quite uninterested in theology. Okay. And the younger generation at that time was born in the 1920s and so would be 100 years old today. or more. Okay. The intelligent youth of all countries are rapidly repudiating orthodox theology, state ecclesiasticism, and the control of the church. They are neither interested in man-made interpretations of truth, nor in past quarrels between the major world religions. At the same time, they are profoundly interested in the spiritual values and are earnestly seeking verification of their deep-seated, unvoiced recognitions. And this certainly did develop with the consciousness explosion, which I guess it followed the Second World War, and especially surfaced in the 1960s. They look to no Bible or system of so-called inspired spiritual knowledge and revelation, but their eyes are on the undefined larger wholes in which they seek to merge and lose themselves, such as the state, an ideology, or humanity itself. Okay, well, this is the the intelligent youth and what they seek to do. Now, some of us may have been part of this intelligent youth, and we're no longer young in that way. What does the youth of today want, really, in a deep sense, in a sense that casts aside all these superficialities that we do see? So repudiation of orthodoxy and profound interest in the spiritual values and the verification of certain deep recognitions which had not come to the fore so popularly before this, as so much was ruled by the priestcraft. In this expression of the spirit of self-abnegation may be seen the appearance of the deepest truth of all religions and the justification of the Christian message. They seek to merge or lose themselves in what? In the state, in an ideology, in humanity itself. This is a Neptunian quality, this merging in a greater whole, and this is the possibility, and it has been done. The religions of the East, the philosophies of the East have come to the West and have facilitated this merging or losing of themselves. Okay. Christ in his high place cares not whether men accept the theological interpretations of scholars and churchmen, but he does care whether the keynotes of his life of sacrifice and service are reproduced among men. It is immaterial to him whether the emphasis laid upon the detail and veracity of the gospel story is recognized and accepted, for he is more interested that the search for truth and for subjective spiritual experience should persist. He knows that within each human heart is found that which responds instinctively to God, and that the hope of the ultimate glory lies hid in the Christ consciousness. So the emphasis is upon consciousness and not the acceptance of outer formulations which can bog the great quest down. Okay, so that's interesting. And of course, so many churchmen today will say, this is nonsense, and Christ is precisely interested in the acceptance of all these things in this paragraph, which DK casts aside or repudiates. The spirit of self-abnegation, yes. The merging idea. In other words, what this is here, what can we call it? The defeat of the lower ego. This is what is interesting to the many. The defeat of the lower ego through self-abnegation. The lower ego will never abnegate itself. It always has to stand out, control, and direct and dominate. So this is the appearance of the deepest truth of all religion and the justification of the Christian message. This is the tendency which the young people of that time were evidencing, and I think that many of the young people of today. The big question remains, did we have an opportunity? Did we utilize it? Did we pass it? Has humanity retrogressed into more personal and elemental quests rather than in the high idealism which followed the end of the war? When one was living in the 1960s, which I did, it was like another world. And the 1970s also, once the doctrines of the East were spread abroad. I remember I lived in Minnesota as a teacher of vocal music and choir and things of that nature. And I went to something called the Gnostica bookstore in 1968 or 69, and I spent the whole day in the bookstore, and I could not believe what I found there in terms of the opening up to the great possibilities of consciousness studies. I think I could barely make it back to the train. I was carrying so many books, and it was a great moment. I had to walk very, very far, some miles, to find the place, and then some miles back, carrying all of that book luggage, you might say. So it was a time of great revelation. I'm sure that many people living through the 60s, passing through the 60s and 70s, found it a time of great revelation as well. Sometimes it got sidetracked and it became a little maybe hedonistic and into all the pleasures which the lower form could offer. But behind it all was, I think, the 1966 appropriation by the Christ of the vestures of the Buddha. The DK makes a special comment about that, of when it would take place. It was written in the book Cosmic Fire, I think, written in 1925 or completed in 1925, and it did indeed occur at that time in the 60s, I do believe. So let's see, if I were to look here for 1966, would I only find one? A very interesting period will come about in the year 1966 and persist to the end of the century. It is one for which the great ones are already making due preparation. It concerns the centennial effort of the Lodge and of the personages taking part therein. Each century sees a centennial effort of the Lodge along a particular line of force made to forward the ends of evolution, and the efforts of the 20th century will be upon a larger scale than has been the case for a very long time, and will involve a number of the great ones. I think, it's somewhere here. In a similar effort during the 19th century, HPB was concerned, and a fairly large number of chelas. In the efforts immediately ahead, several of the great ones are concerned, and the master of all masters himself. In their forthcoming for work, 3 out of the various methods of appearing mentioned earlier will be seen in full activity. Here it is. I trust and think. Sometimes I make references up, don't we all? But, or exaggerate. In the appearing of the Bodhisattva himself, the mystery of the Bodhisattva will be seen in its fullest sense, and it is not for us here to enlarge upon it. Suffice it to say, the vestures of the Great One will be used. But time will show whether the coming Lord will clothe upon those vestures a physical physical vehicle at this particular juncture, or whether the astral plane may not be his field of activity. And then it goes on into the vestures of the Buddha. They are very highly magnetized and have a profound and far-reaching effect When utilized, they are act as a focal point for the force of the Lord Buddha, because he's still involved with being able to contact those vestures and link up the coming Lord, that is, whoever it is, and it is the Christ now, with him, enabling him to increase his own stupendous resources by drawing upon still higher forces via the Lord Buddha. And it strikes me that the triadal vehicles of the Buddha are definitely involved in what we call the vestures. Now, I don't think the lower vehicles are per se, but remember that the Christ at this point is creating a Maya Virupa, and as an initiate of the sixth degree, he is not subject to the normal methods of birth. Therefore, okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? From a treatise on cosmic fire, page 754. Important. Now just imagine being able to plug in the word 1966 and come up with that reference rather than what book was that in? Oh, yes. And then going through all of the indexes and then paging through the pages and maybe finding it after 5 or 10 minutes, maybe. And here, zingo, there it is. So I must say that the synthesizing of the books at this time has been greatly facilitated by the appearance of the Alice Bailey CD-ROM and the discussion of the vestures. Now, in 1925, when this was published, it was not known per se the manner in which the Christ would reappear, maybe no lower than the astral plane. Then, what was it? Steiner was writing about Christ in the etheric, and only after 1945, or in 1945, was it confirmed that the Christ would use a physical vehicle. Well, anyway, I hope I've done this correctly. This force and its expression upon the astral plane, producing vast results of a quieting nature and bringing, by reflex action, peace on earth. Oh, there's such beautiful things written here. I just recommend it, and let us spread the knowledge of these books in anticipation of something maybe even more powerful coming very shortly on ahead. Because we do have to reach the intelligence of mankind, the intelligentsia, who have the best chance perhaps of bridging intelligently into modern spiritual occultism, have to be reached in a convincing manner. They do have barriers as well because they have a certain dogmatism and pride of mind that they will not relinquish. But I think they can be reached. It's not only the gullible believing people of the world who should be reached. They may be reached in terms of their aspiration, but they might not understand what spiritual occultism really is, and in that sense would not be ready for it. But there are just so many thousands that can be appropriately reached, and so we do our best. We do our best. Okay, therefore, in the New World Order, that's the whole thing, isn't it? The new order of the centuries. If I could take out the dollar bill in America, I would see it, with Master R as Francis Bacon behind it all. Therefore, in the New World Order, spirituality will supersede theology. Living experience will take the place of theological acceptances. We'll know it's so because we've experienced it. The spiritual realities will emerge with increasing clarity, and the form aspect will recede into the background. Dynamic expressive truth will be the keynote of the new world religion. The living Christ will assume his rightful place in human consciousness and see the fruition of his plans, sacrifice, and service, but the hold of the ecclesiastical orders will weaken and will disappear. Well, certainly, we're somewhat in that right now. And people certainly, I mean, the conventional church is weakening everywhere, except maybe in the most ecstatic of the groups, filled with people whose only goal is to believe in preference to deep thinking. We need to supersede two things: violent belief without thought, excessive thought of a concrete nature about religion, and we need to move into deep thought plus spiritual experience. Only those will remain as guides and leaders of the human spirit who speak from living experience and who know no creedal barriers. Sometimes in India, it is distinguished between who really are self-realized masters and those who are simply talkers. So I number myself among the talkers, but before long, okay, they will recognize the onward march of revelation and the new emerging truths. These truths will be founded on the ancient realities, but will be adapted to modern need and will manifest progressively the revelation of the divine nature and quality. God is now known as intelligence and love. That the past has given us. He must be known as purpose and will and purpose, and that the future will reveal. So, who are the teachers? What will they be? They will be other than what we have had in the past. You can always tell when the teaching is alive and really represents some kind of knowledge, and you can tell when it's just a repetition. So let's just say the teaching. Okay, now, come on. Is this going to stall on me? Okay, TEA, teaching of the future. Only those will remain as guides and leaders of the living spirit, of the human spirit, who speak from living experience. We've seen this already, certain gurus have emerged and they have about them the stamp of authenticity, and one simply knows intuitively that they are knowers, okay? I mean, certainly when you were dealing with such an individual as Yogananda, we did know. He's a knower. Paramahansa, fourth degree, beyond the Hansa, para, beyond. Okay. The onward march of revelation and the new emerging truths. And ancient is their origin, but they are adapted to modern need. Even the Vedanta, with its emphasis upon uniformity of being, can be adapted to modern need in promoting the brotherhood of all incarnated and, I said incarnated monads. Yes, they are incarnated in the 5 lower subplanes. When the racial of the cosmic physical plane, when the racial problem has disappeared through the recognition of the one life, when the economic problem has been solved by the nations working cooperatively together, when the problem of right government within each nation has been determined by the free will of their respective peoples, and the spirit of true religion is unobstructed by the ancient forms and interpretations, we shall see a world in process of right experience, right relations, and a spirit of moving forward into reality. This is a very important paragraph, and it lists basically the problems he's been dealing with in terms of the New World Order. The racial problem, the economic problem, the problem of government, and the spirit of the problem of religion. That is what we've been dealing with, and maybe we've learned something about how he sees it all. Then we shall see a world in process of right experience, right human relations, and a spiritual moving forward into reality. Then we shall see that. Well, and here he is holding this all out to people at a time when even the hierarchy had concerns about whether humanity would make it, and those concerns only deepened as we went along until a point of real crisis was reached, and somehow humanity, because of its inchoate invocation, was not allowed to go down by the efforts of the Lords of Liberation. A study of these four lines of, well, let's list them again. So what we have is race, we have economics, we have government, and we have religion. Now, the problems of humanity are more than that, but all of these play into it. Today, one of the most severe problems is the problem of the deteriorating environment through climate change. And of course, the threat of modern weaponry has only become greater, even though treaties have been signed and the selfish seek to abrogate those treaties. But, inexperience will yield through pain experience. A study of these four lines of human living will show how truly Germany is today the focal point of world situation. In that unhappy nation, the racial problem has attained such importance that the entire world is affected. From the economic angle, Hitler has said that Germany has been forced to fight in order to preserve the life, economically speaking, of her people. Factually, the economic life of Germany was not as critically threatened as that of many smaller nations. But the greed, of course, entered. The problem of government has also been brought to a critical point by German activity and conquest, and by the emphasis laid by the Axis powers upon the relation of the state to the individual. The individual basically is obliterated except for the leaders. The attitude of the German rulers to religion is recognized as one of profound antagonism, except for the revival of the ancient Nordic gods, which DK said was a real threat. Thus, the four major world problems are today being precipitated by Germany into the area of action. Okay. Well, we still have issues of race, issues of government, we have issues of economics, we have issues of religion. We still have it all. And in many ways, it's not an act of precipitating shooting war, but it's no closer to resolution. So they are evoking inquiry everywhere. The attention of men in every land is now focused on these problems, and solution is inevitable when the war is over, when the problems are rightly approached and by men and women of goodwill, not the dominating Axis powers. Then we shall see a world planning for the production of harmonious living such as never before has been possible. And the sort of millennial goals brought forth in the United Nations is an example of this. Okay, well, I think I'll just read one more because then the italics have to be taken care of. It is for humanity to solve its serious problems on the basis of brotherhood, and so bring in a way of living which will provide adequate supply of the necessities of life through the proper organizing of time, labor, and goods. This will lead to an interplay between the citizen and the state, which will evoke the service of the individual and the right protection of the state. Humanity will then be free for the experiment of spiritual living, and this will express itself through awakened human lives. Can more be asked for or expected than this? Such a way of life can be made possible if the men and women of goodwill, of intelligence and idealism can begin the task of inaugurating the new world order. And there we have, what this whole section has been about, the new world order. and the benefits of that new world order on the basis of brotherhood. Certainly, the indications are clear. It's just that so many selfish people just are blind to the possibilities. So this now, friends, is the end, end of hour 2. And whether I can forge ahead, I don't know. I said that before when it was 1.5 hours. But we certainly have a practical, though idealistic, way of solving our problems suggested to us by the Tibetan, and it's the men and women of goodwill, and especially those of still more intense concentration, called members of the new group of world servers, who are responsible for spearheading these vital changes following that war. And it happened through the United Nations. Still, however, the battles for hegemony, for dominance, for resources, for the exaltation of the leader, all those things went on. All those things continued, but gradually I think there is a weakening of that way of living. And right now, with the reemergence of dictatorial tendencies, I think they will prove themselves to be so inadequate, so dangerous, that they will be weakened still further, and progress towards these new and spiritually expected developments can occur. We will solve these things, but the hierarchy will help in ways that it is lawful to help. They can't do anything for us, per se, on the outer plane. We are the human hands, we are the human feet, and inspired by thought, which the higher parts of our nature stimulate and which hierarchy stimulates, we will have to carry these things forward according to our own free will and do it together cooperatively. Okay, so let's just pause at that point and see how much farther we can take it. I may have to send this to you at this point, I'm not sure. Okay, friends, I think actually I will end this little program. It's 2-hour program, end of 17, and taking us up to page 203. We've done about 142 or 3 pages in this book so far, and we'll begin when we can on program 18, hopefully today, and if not, soon. Okay, thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.